Immediately seizing central squares, the pawn opens lines for king's bishop and queen, asserting aggressive early influence. Opening the central diagonal fosters immediate piece activity and sets the stage for potential pawn breaks, mirroring white's ambition for central influence. Challenging the e5 pawn, this knight immediately seeks central influence and prepares to castle. Developing the knight to its natural square, this solidifies the pawn and prepares for further central development, offering good defensive coverage. Opening the path for queenside pressure, this bishop develops aggressively, eyeing potential weaknesses. Challenging white's bishop directly probes the pawn's structure and opens the file for potential counterplay. Preserving the bishop's diagonal pressure against the knight, while tactically delaying the decision of its long-term fate, is a sound positional maneuver. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move simultaneously attacks white's pawn on e4, creating immediate central tension. Securing the monarch is paramount, allowing pieces to develop freely and press the center with confidence. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, this piece subtly anchors the pawn chain and looks to unburden the kingside. Preparing to bolster the central pawn chain, white repositions the rook to the open file, aiming for a more flexible defense of the e4 pawn and potentially supporting a future d4 advance, creating a solidifying defensive posture while keeping lines of communication open for a queenside regrouping. Demanding space on the queenside, black forces the bishop to retreat once more, potentially disrupting its influence on the kingside diagonal and preparing for further pawn advances. This gambit of tempo for queenside expansion might create weaknesses later if not supported correctly. Resuming the bishop's retreat, strategically repositioning it to a more passive square, aiming to avoid immediate pawn pressure and preserve the bishop's influence from the flank. This maneuver seeks to maintain defensive integrity while patiently waiting for opportunities to develop a more dynamic attacking posture later in the game, perhaps by reinforcing the d4 square or preparing a potential kingside initiative. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing to challenge white's bishop on b3, this move also opens a diagonal for black's queen while subtly preparing for a potential queenside pawn push. Reinforcing the d4 square becomes paramount now, preparing for a potential pawn push that might seize central space and limit black's queenside expansion. Securing the monarch is paramount, and this castling maneuver wisely shields the king behind a now solid pawn chain, while also bringing the rook closer to central action. Preventing a kingside nuisance, white subtly shores up their defenses, preparing for a potential central breakthrough while also denying black any immediate dark square pawn advances that could disrupt white's knight or bishop. Strategically repositioning the knight from an active central square to the edge of the board, this maneuver aims to bypass the pin on the c6 knight and potentially prepare a queenside pawn advance, though it sacrifices considerable tempo and central influence in the process. Unlocking the center with d4 boldly challenges black's setup, immediately seeking to dismantle the pawn chain and potentially create open lines for white's pieces. Developing the knight to d7 unblocks the c8 bishop and prepares to challenge white's central pawn with c5. This maneuver, though seemingly slow, aims to disrupt white's comfortable pawn chain and activate black's dormant pieces. The knight's new home on d7 also supports a potential queenside pawn push, subtly increasing black's spatial influence. It's a patient build-up, anticipating a strategic confrontation rather than immediate fireworks. Seeking to dislodge the knight and open lines for his own pieces, white boldly advances his knight to the edge of the board, a typical Ruy-Lopez maneuver aiming to disrupt black's setup and create potential attacking chances. Unleashing the central tension, this capture immediately redefines the pawn structure and opens avenues for piece activity, forcing white to reconsider their king's safety amidst the d-file's potential. Reclaiming central pawn influence is the immediate objective, pushing back the knight's encroachment and simultaneously opening a pathway for the queen's potential deployment. Rerouting the knight to b6 signals a strategic repositioning, aiming to challenge white's influential bishop on b3 and potentially support a future queenside pawn push. This maneuver avoids immediate confrontation and seeks to improve the knight's scope, though it does concede some central space for the moment. Sharpening the knight's influence on the central squares, this repositioning prepares for potential pawn advances or offers defensive reinforcement in anticipation of black's queenside buildup. Boldly challenging white's central pawn and eyeing the weakened light squares around the king, this knight redeployment signals an immediate intent to disrupt white's comfortable setup and prepare for a more active role in the ensuing middle game skirmishes. The knight redirects, sacrificing its central presence for a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened kingside structure black has inadvertently allowed by its earlier pawn pushes and knight maneuvers. This repositioning aims to exploit the lack of immediate counterplay for black's knights and potentially support a future g4 push, creating discomfort around the enemy king's shelter. Consider how the knights are now subtly influencing each other's scope. White's f3 knight might be a stepping stone for further infiltration or a pivot to shore up a vulnerable square. The knight's daring leap to b4 creates a fascinating web of tactical possibilities and positional pressures, aiming to disrupt white's queenside harmony and potentially exploit the weakened c3 square. Unleashing a pawn to the 5th rank, white aggressively contests central space and aims to restrict black's knight on b6, potentially creating an outpost for their own pieces or forcing a concession. Black's counterthrust on the queenside immediately challenges white's central pawn chain, aiming to open lines for counterplay and disrupt white's spatial advantage. This aggressive pawn push, while potentially weakening the queenside structure, seeks to activate the knight on b6 and create an escape square for the knight on d7, offering a dynamic approach to a position where white had begun to accumulate a slight edge. It forces white to reconsider their central dominance and consider how to react to this potential queenside expansion, potentially leading to sharper play. Seizing the opportunity to disrupt black's pawn structure, white exchanges material, opening lines and potentially creating weaknesses in the queenside for the opponent. Reclaiming the pawn after white's aggressive advance opens up new avenues for development and prepares a counterplay on the queenside. The knight embarks on a curious journey, potentially aiming to shore up the d-pawn's defense or redeploy to a more active square on the kingside. But the immediate repositioning feels somewhat passive given the pawn structure's current rigidity. Instantly developing the bishop to this active diagonal enhances black's queenside pressure and prepares to challenge white's central influence. Unburdening the kingside, white repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, anticipating a potential queenside pawn push from black while keeping an eye on the d6 pawn. The knight's journey to a5 aims to challenge the powerful bishop on b3, initiating a positional duel for control of key diagonals and potentially opening lines for the queen or rooks. Challenging the pawn chain's integrity, this maneuver redirects the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially preparing for an assault on black's queenside weaknesses. Embracing the open diagonal for the bishop, this piece repositions itself to eye the central pawn structure and prepare for a potential kingside sortie. It simultaneously offers prophylaxis against any premature knight incursions on the c4 square. A subtle repositioning, the knight now aims to pierce black's queenside defenses by potentially hopping to f5, exerting pressure on the a2-g8 diagonal and restricting the f6 knight's activity. Shifting the knight to c4 aims to disrupt white's bishop pair and potentially open lines against the kingside, though it does leave the d5 pawn somewhat exposed and invites further maneuvering from white's pieces, perhaps involving a d6 pawn push or a repositioning of the knight. Disrupting black's knight coordination on the queenside opens lines for white's pieces. Reclaiming the outpost after the exchange, black reestablishes a knight on a strategically superior square, eyeing the weakness on d5 and preparing potential incursions down the c-file, while white must now reconsider the balance of pieces in the center. Sensing an opportunity to disrupt black's knight coordination, this sortie immediately targets the bishop on b7, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses around the king. Seeking to break the knight's hold on the d4 square and potentially repositioning for a kingside attack, this retreat looks to redefine the central pawn structure. Exchanging knights clarifies the central structure and opens lines towards black's king, though it also offers a pathway for black's bishops to become more active. Black reclaims the pawn lost to the exchange, simultaneously opening the d-file for the rook and creating a more solid pawn structure in the center, a critical step towards activating dormant pieces like the g7 bishop. Unlocking the diagonal for the bishop, this move actively pressures the pawn chain and begins a strategic reorientation, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares around black's king. Reclaiming your queen with this maneuver, although seemingly passive, subtly shifts the game's focus towards a dynamic endgame by simplifying the material. The open, a file now belongs to white's rook, a significant prize that will soon be put to use pressuring black's queenside. A tactical shift from the queenless middle game, RFD8 immediately contesting the crucial d-file and preparing to activate the rook into the heart of white's position. Sacrificing the knight to disrupt black's coordination and open lines is a bold gamble, aiming to exploit the exposed dark squares around the black king and potentially create a passed pawn later. Opening up the kingside with this capture, you've created a series of pawn weaknesses around your monarch, but simultaneously gained a pawn majority on the queenside, a crucial element for the approaching endgame. Observe how the bishop on b3 now exerts considerable pressure on the long diagonal, and the white rooks are poised to exploit the open files. Consider the long-term implications of this doubled pawn. It signifies a fundamental shift in the pawn structure, creating dynamic imbalances that will dictate the flow of the game for many moves to come. Think about how to coordinate your remaining pieces to defend against the impending threats and leverage your newly acquired queenside advantage. Initiating a rook exchange to simplify into an endgame, this move seeks to neutralize black's potentially active pieces and create new pawn structures. By clearing the first rank, white aims to establish better control over open files and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's kingside defense, now that the g-file is less controlled. The removal of active rooks also signals a shift towards a more strategic, potentially slower-paced phase of the game, where precise piece placement and pawn manipulation will become paramount. Reclaiming the central file offers a chance to regroup, but the pawn structure is permanently damaged, leaving the king exposed to future attacks. Repositioning the bishop to e7 offers a subtle but significant upgrade, establishing a robust defensive perimeter for the king, and simultaneously preparing to connect the remaining rooks for future coordinated action. The rook's repositioning to the fourth rank initiates a subtle but significant territorial grab, aiming to exploit any potential weaknesses in white's king's safety by cutting off escape squares. Solidifying the rook on the open file, white aims to control the important d-file and prevent black's rook from becoming more active. Reclaiming the bishop immediately solidifies black's material advantage and prepares for a more active defense. Sacrificing material to remove the dangerous defender and expose the king's weak pawn structure presents a potent opportunity, potentially opening lines for your remaining pieces to exploit. The monarch's repositioning to f8 signals a desperate attempt to escape the immediate threats lurking in the center, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed to future attacks along the open files. Fortifying the queenside pawn structure prevents any immediate pressure black might generate by attacking the pawn, and simultaneously prepares to activate the rook on the file, aiming for a more balanced distribution of forces in the ensuing endgame. A bold attempt to salvage positional equality, this bishop maneuver now directly contests control over the d4 square, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the queenside if white isn't careful. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside now seems less relevant as the primary battle shifts to controlling the central files and exploiting the weakness of black's isolated d-pawn, creating a decisive endgame advantage. Regaining the pawn now feels premature. A more patient maneuver to consolidate the newly arrived rook on the open file would have been prudent, allowing for better coordination and potential future threats. The rook's repositioning towards the third rank opens avenues for potential future attacks on the weakened black kingside pawn structure, a subtle but important strategic shift. a bold attempt to stir up complications with that rook lift, aiming to destabilize the newly acquired pawn structure and maybe pressure the queen's knight out of its comfy square. Boldly challenging the bishop's dominion, this repositioning aims to wrestle control of the crucial central squares, potentially liberating the knight for more active participation, and seeking to exploit any static weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Launching this pawn forward aims to disturb the rigid structure white has established, perhaps seeking to create counterplay on the king side, or simply gain a breath of air for the king. Solidifying the pawn structure, white endeavors to stabilize the center and create a defensive wall, preventing black's active pieces from finding new entry points. Instigating a pawn push like this, with its inherent commitment, aims to disrupt white's solidifying pawn structure and potentially create a queenside passed pawn down the line. Bringing the king to the center offers an active defense, preventing it from being a target on the edge and preparing it to participate in pawn play on the king side. Opening up lines on the queen side might seem tempting, but this push invites a potential pawn storm that could leave your king exposed as white consolidates their central advantage. Injecting immediate attacking potential, this advance on the king side seeks to exploit the weakened pawn structure surrounding black's monarch, aiming to pry open lines and create mating threats before black can solidify their defenses. Opening up that h-file for your rook creates immediate attacking potential, potentially targeting the enemy king once it's exposed. The pawn push opens a clear line for your rook, threatening to advance and create unstoppable threats. Abandoning the passed pawn is a significant concession, as the king's weakened structure becomes an immediate target for the encroaching rooks. Repositioning the bishop to a more active square allows it to pressure black's pawn chain and potentially support future advances on the queen side. The rook now seeks refuge on the d-file, a quiet repositioning to observe white's next intention after its own forced retreat. Opening up the f-file now allows your rook to become a potent force, potentially pinning the black king or creating tactical opportunities through further pawn pushes. The rook's aggressive dance across the 7th rank now culminates in a check, forcing the opposing king into a decidedly uncomfortable square and seizing a vital tempo for further penetration. King's royal promenade through the newly opened diagonals, seeking refuge from the persistent pressure along the d-file. King hunt initiated, the black monarch dances forward, exposing its own vulnerable position to a potential knight fork while simultaneously aiming to exploit white's somewhat exposed royal. Escaping the perpetual checking sequence and consolidating the king's position behind the pawns offers a breath of fresh air, allowing white to regroup and assess the remaining material. The rook's repositioning to the d2 square initiates a dangerous infiltration, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and potentially create mating threats against the exposed white king. Unleashing a pawn storm, white injects dynamism into the position, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and create immediate attacking chances. The bishop aims to occupy a more active diagonal, eyeing potential breakthroughs and providing support for a pawn advance on the king side. Pivoting the monarch to the open files, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses and initiate a decisive endgame assault. Seizing the open d-file offers a crucial avenue for penetration, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially threaten the king's remaining defense. Opening the c-file to threaten the black king's somewhat exposed position seems like the primary objective, aiming to create new attacking avenues. Reactivating the rook on the open file, Ruy-1* aims to challenge white's control of the central d-file, potentially creating threats against the isolated pawn on e5 and influencing the endgame dynamics as pieces continue to be exchanged. Pressing the a4 pawn forces black to commit to a queenside pawn structure. Seeking to reposition the king to a safer square, the monarch endeavors to escape the open files and the persistent threats of the opposing pieces, aiming for a more sheltered central position to weather the storm of the endgame. Initiating a central pawn push now aims to crack open the defensive setup and exploit the compromised king side,